65 miles north of San Francisco, you're standing on a bluff above the Pacific Ocean. The wind is cold, the sea is gray, and above you, standing since 1812, is a Russian fort. Not a ruin, not a replica. Fort Ross actually stands here, accompanied with real Russian cannons and a real Russian Orthodox church. In the 1800s, real Russian colonists traveled 10,000 miles from St. Petersburg to farm this California soil. This is an alternate history. This isn't a what-if scenario. For 29 years, from 1812 to 1841, Russia held a permanent settlement on the California coast, and almost nobody knows about it. Today, we're going to fix that, because the story of Russian America is one of the most dramatic, improbable, and ultimately tragic imperial adventures in history. It involves a czar who ruled a sixth of the world's landmass, a fur trade worth billions in today's money, a one-eyed Siberian merchant who nearly became the emperor of the Pacific, and a secret love affair that may have changed the course of history. And the sale, the most consequential real estate deal of the 19th century that almost didn't happen. This is the story of Russian America, and it begins not in California, not even in Alaska, but in a frozen Siberia city 4,000 miles away. To understand why Russia ended up on the coast of California, you have to understand one of the most astonishing territorial expansions in human history. In 1581, the same decade that England was planting its first tentative colonies in North America, a Cossack adventurer named Yermak Timofeyevich crossed the Ural Mountains with just 840 men and began conquering Siberia for Tsar Ivan the Terrible. Within 60 years, Russian fur traders and Cossack soldiers had crossed the entire Asian continent and reached the Pacific Ocean. 60 years. That's the same amount of time it took American settlers to push from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. But Russia crossed a land mass 3 times as wide. How did they do it? Fur. Specifically, sable. A small cat-like animal with fur so dense, so lustrous, and so warm that European and Asian elites would pay almost any price for it. In the 17th century, sable pelts were literally used as currency. A single high-quality sable skin could cost the equivalent of a year's wages for a craftsman. The Russian government demanded fur as taxation, called yasak, from the indigenous peoples of Siberia. At its peak, the fur trade accounted for roughly 1/3 of the entire Russian state's revenue. But fur required animals, and animals, once hunted extensively in one region, disappeared. So hunters moved east, always eastward, chasing the animals, chasing the money. Until, in 1648, a Cossack explorer named Semyon Desnov sailed around the northeast tip of Asia, through what we now call the Bering Strait, proving that Asia and America were separate continents. He filed his report, but nobody in Moscow paid much attention. In January 1725, Tsar Peter the Great was dying. He had transformed Russia from a medieval backwater into a European power. He had built St. Petersburg out of a swamp. He had created the Russian Navy from nothing. He had personally worked as a shipwright in Holland to learn naval engineering, and on his deathbed, with barely enough strength to hold a pen, he issued one final command. He ordered Vitus Bering, a Danish-born officer in the Russian Navy, to sail north and east and determine once and for all whether Asia and America were connected by land. Peter died before Bering could even leave, but the mission went ahead. Bering's first expedition, launched in 1725, was a logistical nightmare that took 3 years just to reach the Pacific coast of Siberia. The team hauled all of their equipment, including the timber to build their ships, overland across thousands of miles of roadless wilderness. Men died of scurvy, starvation, exposure, and even more threats. When Bering finally sailed in 1728, he passed through the strait that would bear his name, confirmed that Asia and America were separate, but saw no American coastline, and turned back. He returned to St. Petersburg in 1730. Again, the results were inconclusive. The Empress demanded he try again. Bering spent the next decade planning the most ambitious expedition in Russian history. The Second Kamchatka Expedition, also called the Great Northern Expedition, was staggering in scale. It included nearly 3,000 people, consisting of scientists, surveyors, sailors, soldiers, and support staff. It produced the first accurate maps of Siberia's Arctic coast, cataloged hundreds of new species, and documented dozens of indigenous languages and cultures. But the most important and unfortunate part came in June 1741 when Bering, now 60 years old and in failing health, finally sailed east from the Kamchatka Peninsula with two ships, the St. Peter and the St. Paul. On July 16, 1741, he sighted the peak of what is now Mount St. Elias in Alaska. Russian explorers had finally reached North America. They didn't stay long. The weather was terrible, the crew was sick, and Bering himself was so ill he had to be carried below deck. On the return voyage, the St. Peter was wrecked on a desolate island near the Kamchatka coast. Bering died there in December 1741, his body half buried in sand, weakened by scurvy as the subarctic winter closed in around them. This island is now called Bering Island. However, the survivors brought something back that would change everything. Sea otter pelts. The naturalist Georg Wilhelm Steller, one of the most remarkable scientists in Russian history, who had somehow found time during a 10-hour shore excursion in Alaska to describe 4 new species of animals, including a bird and a sea mammal that would later bear his name. He had carefully documented the sea otters the crew had encountered. Their fur, the survivors reported when they finally straggled back to Kamchatka, was unlike anything seen before. Thicker than sable, more lustrous, and worth a fortune in the Chinese market where fashionable Manchu noblemen would pay extraordinary sums for otter-trimmed robes. Within a year, Russian hunters were racing east across the Aleutian Islands. The sea otter rush had officially begun. The men who followed Bering's route east were called Promyelniki, Russian fur traders and hunters. They were, in many ways, the Russian equivalent of American frontiersmen. Tough, brutal, and mostly lawless men who operated at the edge of the known world with minimal government oversight and maximal personal ambition. Their methods were simple and devastating. They would arrive in an Aleut village, take the men hostage, and force them to hunt sea otters, animals the Aleuts had hunted sustainably for thousands of years. Women and children were held as collateral. Men who resisted were killed. It was, by any modern definition, a system of enslavement. The Aleuts resisted. In 1762 and 1763, they launched coordinated attacks on Russian ships and camps, destroying 4 vessels and killing 200 Russians, the largest military defeat the Russians would suffer in their North American territories. The response was savage. Punitive expeditions wiped out entire villages, and by some estimates, the Aleut population collapsed by 80% in the first 4 decades of Russian contact. This is perhaps one of the darkest chapters in Russian America. Greed, enabled by the near-total absence of government accountability, had led to colonial genocide. The fur returns, however, were extraordinary. Sea otter pelts that cost almost nothing to acquire through forced labor sold in Canton for the equivalent of hundreds of dollars each, and sometimes more. Between 1743 and 1800, Russian hunters slaughtered an estimated 2 million sea otters across the Aleutian Island chain. By 1800, the sea otter was commercially extinct across much of the former range of the western Aleutians. The hunters had to push further and further east into Alaska proper and eventually south into the coastal waters of California. By the 1780s, the chaos of individual Promyelniki operations were creating serious problems for Russia. The fur-bearing animals were hunted near extinction. There was no consistent policy towards the indigenous peoples, and different Russian companies competed violently with one another. And to the south, new rivals were appearing. British and American trading vessels were working the Pacific coast, and Spain, which had claimed sovereignty over the entire western coast of North America, was watching with great alarm. Catherine the Great, who ruled Russia from 1762 to 1796 and was arguably the most capable administrator the Romanov dynasty ever produced, recognized that something had to change. She needed to bring order to Russian America. Her solution was to grant a monopoly. In 1799, her successor Tsar Paul I formally chartered the Russian-American Company, a joint stock trading corporation modeled loosely on the British East India Company. The company was granted exclusive rights to the fur trade in all Russian territories in North America. It was authorized to establish settlements, negotiate with indigenous peoples, and essentially govern Russian America in the Tsar's name. The Russian American company could run Alaska and attempt to colonize California for the next 68 years, until the sale of Russian America to the United States in 1867. Its story is inseparable from the story of one remarkable, infuriating, but visionary man. Alexander Baranov arrived in Alaska in 1791 as the chief manager of a small fur trading company. He was 44 years old, partially bald, and physically unremarkable, but possessed a terrifying amount of energy and willpower. He would spend the next 27 years as the de facto ruler of Russian America. His main goal was to transform a collection of chaotic hunting camps into something approaching a functional colonial enterprise. He learned the Aleut language. He navigated the brutal politics of Russian American company shareholders from thousands of miles away in St. Petersburg. He built ships from scratch, personally led military expeditions, survived assassination attempts, and 2 shipwrecks. He also took an Aleut wife named Anna, with whom he had 2 children, and established a complex household that mixed Russian, Aleut, and eventually other indigenous cultures, a common practice in Russian America that set it apart from both British and American colonial enterprises. Baranov's greatest crisis came from a direction he hadn't fully anticipated: the Tlingit people of southeastern Alaska. The Tlingit were not Aleuts. They were a sophisticated warrior culture with a complex social hierarchy, a rich artistic tradition, and centuries of experience defending their territory against rivals. They had traded with the European and American ships long enough to acquire firearms, and in June 1802, they launched a devastating attack on a Russian fort and settlement, which is now in Sitka, Alaska. The assault was total. The Russian garrison and its Aleut allies, a force of perhaps 300 people, were overwhelmed. The fort was burned, and an estimated 20 to 30 Russians were killed, along with hundreds of Aleuts. Survivors fled to the forest or managed to escape by sea. Baranov was not at Sitka when it happened. He was managing operations elsewhere. When the news reached him, his response was methodical and brutal. He spent 2 years gathering reinforcements, acquiring a naval vessel, the Neva, who had just completed Russia's first circumnavigation of the globe, and assembled a force of 800 Aleut fighters plus a small Russian contingent. In September 1804, Baranov landed on Sitka. The Tlingit had built a new fort on the site of the burned Russian settlement and refused to abandon it. What followed was a weeks-long siege. The Russians had cannons, the Tlingit had muskets, determination, and a fortification that proved remarkably resistant to artillery. Baranov himself was wounded in the arm during an attempt to storm the fort. After 6 days of fighting that killed around 60 Russians and an unknown number of Tlingit, the Tlingit withdrew under cover of night. Baranov rebuilt the settlement and renamed it New Archangel, what is now Sitka, Alaska. He made it the capital of Russian America and ruled it for the next 14 years with an iron hand. At its peak in the 1790s and early 1800s, a prime sea otter pelt sold in Canton, China for between 50 and 80 silver dollars, the equivalent of roughly 1,500 to 2,500 in today's money. A single ship's cargo might hold 1,000 to 3,000 pelts, so one successful voyage could yield the equivalent of 1.5 to 7.5 million in modern terms. The Russian-American company also paid dividends of up to 25% annually during its most profitable years. Shareholders included members of the Russian imperial family. The company's annual revenue at its peak was roughly 2 million rubles, equivalent to perhaps 50 million to 100 million in modern purchasing power. But these profits came with a problem that was already becoming visible during Baranov's tenure. The sea otter population was collapsing. The animals had made Russian America possible, but were being hunted to extinction. The company needed a new strategy. It needed agriculture. It needed a warm water port where ships could be supplied and repaired. In short, it needed California. Here's where our story takes a detour into something that historians still argue about. A story so improbable, so romantic, and so consequential that it became the basis of a famous Russian rock opera. Nikolai Rezanov was everything Alexander Baranov was not. Where Baranov was a rough Siberian merchant, Rezanov was an aristocrat, a courtier, and a man of extraordinary charm and intelligence. He had married the daughter of Grigory Shelikhov, the founder of the company that would become the Russian-American Company. In 1803, Tsar Alexander I appointed Rezanov as the first Russian ambassador to Japan and charged him with leading Russia's first circumnavigation of the globe, a voyage that would resupply Russian America and open trade with Japan. The Japan mission was a total disaster. The Japanese refused to trade, kept Rezanov essentially imprisoned in Nagasaki for 6 months, and sent him home without accomplishing anything. Rezanov arrived in Russia, America, in 1805 in a fury, and found the colony in a state of desperate, potentially fatal crisis. In 1805, New Archangel was starving. The Russian-American Company had failed to establish reliable food supplies for the settlement, relying instead on sporadic shipments from Siberia and trade with passing-by American merchant vessels. But in 1805, no supply ships arrived. The garrison was living on shellfish and roots, and people were dying. Rezanov did something remarkable. He chartered an American merchant ship with a destination for the Spanish colonial settlement of Alta California. In March 1806, the Juno sailed through the Golden Gate, what is now San Francisco Bay, and dropped anchor near the Spanish Presidio. It was the first Russian vessel to enter a California port. Officially, Rezanov was there to trade for food. Unofficially, he was there to spy, to assess Spanish strength in California and gauge whether the colony could be taken, or at least whether Russia might establish a legal trading relationship. What happened next has been debated by historians for more than 2 centuries. The commandant of the San Francisco Presidio was a man named Jose Arguello. He had a daughter. Her name was Maria, known to history as Conchita. She was 15 or 16 years old, while Rezanov was 42. According to contemporaneous accounts, Rezanov and Conchita Arguello fell in love, or at least Rezanov said they did. He formally proposed marriage and her family consented. But there were obstacles. Conchita was Catholic, Rezanov was Orthodox, and Spanish law required the permission of both the Catholic Church and the Spanish crown for the marriage of a Spanish colonial subject to a foreign national. Rezanov promised to sail to St. Petersburg, obtain the Tsar's blessing, convince the Pope to grant a dispensation, and return to claim his bride. He left California in May 1806 with a ship full of grain, cattle, and supplies that saved the starving colony at New Archangel and never returned. Rezanov died in Krasnoyarsk, Siberia in March 1807 during the brutal overland journey back to St. Petersburg. Whether he died of a fever, of exhaustion, or of injuries sustained in a fall from a horse depends on which account history believes. His death, however, was kept secret from Conchita for years. Was it genuine love or cold calculation that led Rezanov and Conchita together? A marriage of diplomatic convenience designed to give Russia a Spanish foothold in California, or something else? Historians are divided. His letters suggest genuine admiration, but he was also, by all accounts, a man of exceptional political cunning. Conchita, for her part, waited for him for years. When she finally learned he was dead, she became a lay Dominican, eventually took former vows, and died as Sister Maria Dominga. Her grave simply says, "She died waiting." The romance of Rezanov and Conchita became one of the most famous love stories in Russian popular culture. It's been performed 1,000 times. It is, in a very, very real sense, the Russian Romeo and Juliet, and almost nobody outside of Russia has ever heard of the Russian rock opera. But here's the controversy the historians actually care about. Did Rezanov's California mission change the trajectory of Russian expansion? He had vision, connections, and the political will to push for formal Russian recognition of California. Perhaps even the seizure of Spanish territory while Spain was distracted by the Napoleonic Wars. A living Rezanov with imperial backing might have changed everything. Instead, he died in a Siberian snowstorm, and Russian California was left to more cautious hands. Despite Rezanov's death, his California mission had demonstrated something crucial. The coastal lands north of the Spanish settlements were rich, undefended, and accessible. In 1812, the same year Napoleon invaded Russia, Ivan Kuskov, one of Baranov's most trusted lieutenants, sailed south from New Archangel with 25 Russian and 80 Aleut hunters and established a permanent settlement on the Sonoma coast of California, a location the local Kashaya Pomo people called Matini. They named it Rosia, or Ross, and built it with extraordinary speed. Within months, they had constructed a wooden stockade with 2 blockhouses, a commandant's house, barracks for the Aleut hunters, workshops, and a small Russian Orthodox chapel. Fort Ross sat on a coastal bluff about 90 feet above the Pacific. The hunting was extraordinarily productive. In its first years, Fort Ross was shipping thousands of sea otter pelts annually. But Fort Ross was always about more than fur. The Russian American company's deeper strategic goal was agriculture, growing food to supply the chronically undernourished settlements of Alaska. California's mild climate and fertile soil seemed perfect for this purpose. The results were mixed. Fort Ross established several outlying ranches called ranchos, stretching up to 15 miles from the main fort. They grew wheat, rye, barley, potatoes, turnips, and cabbages. They raised cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses. They built windmills, the first in California to grind their grain. They constructed the first shipyard on the California coast, building at least 3 ships in the cove below the fort. But agriculture never fulfilled its purpose. The coastal climate at Ross is cool and foggy and excellent for redwoods, but less so for grain. The wheat harvests were consistently disappointing, and the colony exported some food to Alaska, but never enough to make the settlements there self-sufficient. The dream of feeding Alaska from California never materialized. The relationship between the Spanish colonists and the Kashaya-Pomo people who had lived at Matini for thousands of years was, by standards of the 19th century colonialism movement, surprisingly complex. The Russians did not, as the Spanish had done with their mission system, attempt to forcibly convert and conscript the local indigenous populations. They paid the Kashaya, who worked at Fort Ross voluntarily, in goods, in food, in horses, and metal tools. Fort Ross, however, sat in territory already claimed by Spain, and after 1821 by the newly independent nation of Mexico. The Spanish protested the Russian presence loudly and repeatedly. In 1817, the Spanish established Mission San Rafael and Mission San Francisco Solano, partly as a buffer against Russian expansion, but they never had the military strength to actually expel the Russians. The more serious long-term threat came from a different direction. By the 1830s, American settlers were beginning to arrive in California in small but growing numbers. American trading vessels were active along the coast, and the Russian-American Company was becoming increasingly aware that its California venture was failing on its own terms. By 1832, the sea otters were gone, hunted to local extinction by decades of intensive Russian and increasingly American and British hunting. The animals that had made Fort Ross viable had simply vanished from California waters. Without the fur trade, Fort Ross was an agricultural colony that couldn't grow enough food in a territory that belonged to a foreign country, defended by a garrison of less than 400 people, 1,800 miles from the nearest Russian base. It was under these conditions that the company began looking for a buyer. The story of who bought Fort Ross is almost as strange as the story of the fort itself. John Augustus Sutter was a Swiss immigrant who had arrived in California in 1839 with grandiose ambitions, a talent for self-promotion, and debts he was fleeing in Switzerland, Missouri, and Hawaii. He had convinced the Mexican governor of California to grant him a vast tract of land in the Sacramento Valley where he was building a fort, a settlement, and an agricultural empire he called New Helvetia. In 1841, the Russian-American Company, desperate to liquidate its California assets, sold Fort Ross to Sutter. Payable in annual installments of agricultural produce, wheat, peas, tallow, and other goods, Sutter got the fort's buildings, its livestock, its machinery, its cannons, and everything else the Russians had built over 29 years. But he never paid the amount in full. He paid the first few installments in grain and then stopped. The Russian-American Company pursued the debt for years without success, and Sutter eventually stole Fort Ross. And here, in one of history's most extraordinary ironies, in January 1848, 7 years after Sutter bought Fort Ross, a carpenter working at Sutter's mill, a sawmill Sutter had built on the American River, found gold in the millrace. James Marshall's discovery triggered the California gold rush. Sutter's land was overrun by 300,000 prospectors. His cattle were killed, his crops destroyed, and his workers abandoned him. He ended up bankrupt once again, his empire destroyed by the very rush of American settlement that his purchase of Fort Ross had, in a tiny way, helped enable. The Russian-American Company, which had sold its California assets to Sutter and couldn't collect on the debt, never recovered financially from the collapse of the sea otter trade. It limped along for another 26 years, subsidized by the Russian government, until finally the Tsar decided to cut his losses. The sale of Russian America to the United States is one of the most consequential and misunderstood real estate transactions in history. By the 1860s, Russia had multiple reasons to consider selling Alaska. The fur trade that had made the territory valuable was largely destroyed, and the Russian American company was losing money fast. Russia had also just been humiliated in the Crimean War, and Alaska, remote, indefensible, and accessible only to sea, could be immediately captured by the Royal Navy in any future conflicts. Better to sell it to the Americans, who had no quarrel with Russia and who would serve as a buffer against British expansion. There was also a man who wanted it very badly. William Henry Seward was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State and one of the most prescient strategic thinkers in American political history. He had a vision of American expansion across the Pacific, an America that would dominate both the Atlantic and the Pacific and control the sea lanes of the world. He had been trying to purchase additional territory for years. He wanted Cuba, Hawaii, and Canada. When Edward Stoeckel, the Russian ambassador to the United States, approached him in March 1867 with a proposal to sell Russian America, Seward responded with almost indecent speed. Negotiations that might have taken months were concluded in a single night, and on March 30th, 1867, after an all-night session in Seward's home, a treaty was signed. The United States would purchase Russian America, all 586,000 square miles of it, for $7.2 million. That works out to about 2 cents per acre. 2 cents per acre for the largest purchase of territory in American history since the Louisiana Purchase. For a territory that would eventually prove to contain the largest oil field in North American history. For a territory whose commercial fisheries, salmon, pollock, crab, generate roughly $6 billion annually in today's economy. For a territory whose strategic position in the Pacific would prove crucial in World War II and throughout the Cold War. However, the American press was not impressed. Newspapers called it Seward's Folly, Walrussia, Seward's Icebox, and President Johnson's Polar Bear Garden. The treaty passed the Senate by just one vote over the required 2/3. The House of Representatives required the purchase of money, refused to do so for more than a year, holding up the formal transfer. The formal transfer ceremony took place in Sitka, Baranov's new Archangel, on October 18, 1867. It was, in hindsight, the greatest bargain in American history. Seward was vindicated, and the Alaskan Purchase is why October 18th is still celebrated as Alaska Day. An interesting side note that most history books don't include is approximately $165,000 of the $7.2 million was embezzled by de Stoeckel from Russia and Congressional House Committee members. In other words, it's entirely possible that the Alaska Purchase, one of the great triumphs in American diplomacy, was partly accomplished through bribery of American legislatures. The historians have debated the extent and significance of these payments for decades. The evidence is suggestive but incomplete. It remains one of the genuine mysteries of the 19th century American political theater. While the sale of Alaska ended the Russian political sovereignty in North America, Russians left behind something more durable than forts and trading posts. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of Russian America is religious. The Russian Orthodox Church established its first North American presence in Alaska in 1794 when a group of monks arrived at Kodiak Island. Among them was a saint later canonized as Saint Herman of Alaska, the first saint of the Orthodox Church in North America. Herman spent 40 years at Spruce Island near Kodiak, learning Aleut language and culture and establishing a school for children. In a remarkable contrast to the Russian-American company's policies, he actively defended the Aleut people against abuse by company employees. He wrote letters to St. Petersburg documenting these abuses. The Russian Orthodox Church took root in Alaska in a way that no other European religious institutions took root in any North American indigenous communities. Today, roughly 100 Orthodox parishes remain active in Alaska. Christianity, blended with indigenous Aleut and Alutiiq traditions, is the dominant faith. It is one of the most extraordinary examples of religious syncretism in American history. The indigenous peoples most affected by Russian colonialization, the Aleuts, are still here. Their communities might be small, their numbers reduced by centuries of colonial disruption, but they have survived. And in recent decades, there has been a significant cultural revitalization movement, language preservation programs, the revival of traditional crafts, and a growing body of scholarship documenting Aleut history and culture. Aleut is spoken by perhaps 150 to 300 people today, most of them elderly. Linguists are working urgently to document and preserve it. It is one of the most endangered languages in North America, and its potential loss would be an irreplaceable cultural catastrophe. Russian history in America could have certainly played out differently. If Rezanov had not died in Siberia in 1807, he almost certainly would have pushed hard for formal Russian colonization of California. He had the political connections, the imperial ambition, and crucially, the timing. In the years after 1807, Napoleonic Wars consumed European attention and bankrupted Spain's ability to defend its colonies. The California missions were chronically undermanned and undersupplied. A determined Russian push in 1808 or 1809, backed by a naval force, might have well succeeded. If Russian-American Company had managed to solve its agricultural problem, if Fort Ross's farms had produced the surplus it needed, the economic logic for holding California would have been much stronger, and Russia might have pushed for formal recognition of California. If the sea otter population had not collapsed, if the company had proposed sustainable hunting limits even a decade earlier, the fur trade revenue might have funded a much more serious colonization effort along the entire Pacific coast. Any of these contingencies playing out differently could have produced a Russian California, which means a North America in which the United States does not reach the Pacific, in which the gold rush happens in Russian territory, in which the Transcontinental Railroad, if built at all, ends at the Sierra Nevada rather than the Pacific. The consequences can cascade from here indefinitely. History, as always, turned on contingencies. A Siberian snowstorm, a collapsing animal population, a man who couldn't grow enough wheat on foggy coastal hills. So why is Russian America forgotten today? Part of the answer is geographical. Alaska was and is still remote today. Fort Ross, though it's on a California state park just 65 miles north of San Francisco, sits on a stretch of Highway 1 that most tourists never reach. But part of the answer is political. During the Cold War, when most Americans' understanding of Russian was formed, the idea that Russia built a legitimate colonial enterprise on American soil was not a comfortable historical narrative. It was easier to treat the Alaska Purchase as a simple real estate transaction, America buying empty wilderness from a seller who didn't really want it, than to grapple with the complex history of empire, indigenous displacement, and geopolitical rivalry that actually produced it. And part of the answer is that Russian America doesn't fit the dominant narrative of American westward expansion. The story Americans tell about the West is about settlers moving from east to west across a continent. Russian America came from the other direction. It's a story about the Pacific rather than the Atlantic, about sea otters rather than buffalo, about Aleut kayakers rather than cowboys. It requires a different mental map, and it tends to fall through the cracks of a historical imagination built around covered wagons and the Oregon Trail. But it matters. It matters for the understanding of how North America was divided up between competing imperial powers. It matters for the understanding about the indigenous peoples of Alaska and Northern California. And it matters for understanding why Alaska is American rather than Russian and how close it came to becoming otherwise. Fort Ross Historic State Park gets about 100,000 visitors a year. On a weekday in winter, you might have the whole place to yourself. You can walk inside the newly reconstructed stockade, peer into the commandant's house with its Russian furniture and samovar, and stand inside the chapel with its wooden iconoclasties and smell the faint ghost of incense. Outside the fort, the Pacific crashes against the rocks 90 feet below. Somewhere out in those waters, though far fewer than there once were, sea otters float on their backs and wrap themselves in kelp to keep from drifting while they sleep. They were here before the Russians came, and they outlasted the Russian Empire. Alexander Baranov died in 1819 on a ship in the Indian Ocean, returning to Russia after being finally relieved of his command at the age of 72. He had served Russia and Alaska for 28 years and never returned to his homeland. He died at sea, with nothing. His children, by his Aleut wife, remained in Alaska, and his name is on an island. Conchita Arguello waited 50 years for a man who was already dead. Her grave in Benicia says she died waiting. Nikolai Rezanov lies in Krasnoyar, Siberia, in a grave that was lost for more than a century and rediscovered in 1990. When Russian rock star Alexander Gradsky heard about the discovery, he wept. Vitus Bering is buried on the island that bears his name, somewhere in the subarctic fog of the western Pacific, in a grave that has been relocated and re-excavated multiple times by archaeologists trying to understand exactly what killed him. And Russia's American empire is a ghost. It is in the onion domes of Sitka's St. Michael's Cathedral, rebuilt after a fire in 1966 with the original icon saved by parishioners running into the burning building. It is in the Aleut Orthodox communities of the Pribilof Islands who kept the Russian liturgy alive through decades of American neglect and sometimes persecution. It is in the Russian surnames you find scattered throughout Alaskan phone books. It is in the dialects that died with its last speakers. It is in the 586,000 square miles of territory that America bought for 2 cents an acre that turned out to contain more oil, more fish, more gold, more natural beauty, and more strategical value than anyone ever imagined. Seward's Folly became the greatest bargain in American history.